Hello, hi, how are you? Good to see you. Oh, thanks for coming. This is part 2.
With Sherman's resounding victory, things were looking up. A wave of confidence swept through the North. When the 8th of November rolled around, a newly energized Lincoln would crush his opponent at the ballot box. Shortly after, Sherman would depart for the sea. It's worth noting here that this wasn't the original plan. John Hood was taking the remnants of his army up to Tennessee, goading Sherman to follow him. Both Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant wanted the general to do just that. But Uncle Billy had other ideas. There, ahead of time, lay the heart of Dixie, the largest Confederate state, rich with crops and cotton, a place of agriculture and plantations, both the breadbasket of the South and its economic colossus. If the strategy of exhaustion called for curtailing the enemy's physical ability to make war, then Sherman didn't just want to stop with Atlanta. As he wrote to Grant, "Until we can repopulate Georgia, it is useless to occupy it. But the utter destruction of its roads, houses, and people will cripple their military resources. I can make the march and make Georgia howl." When Lincoln heard of Sherman's plan, his original response was something along the lines of, "What the f***, dude? No." What eventually swung him round was Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was wary about the proposed march too, but he respected Sherman. When the older man leaned on him, he agreed to talk the president around. He told Lincoln that this wasn't the same as letting Hood rampage in Tennessee unchecked, that Sherman had already dispatched George Thomas to stop the Confederate force. It was a tough sell, but in the end, Lincoln bowed to Grant's experience. Grant formally gave his old friend the go-ahead. On November the 10th, Uncle Billy ordered new fires to be set in Atlanta.
And it should be said, Grant may not have 100% backed it, but he, as I said, he respected Sherman, trusted him. When he went to Lincoln, pretty much said the exact same thing. And Lincoln had so many commanders up to that point where he would, I'm going to say, dilly-dally in what he wanted them to do, because he wanted people, he needed commanders who would fight. You know, George McClellan is a prime example of somebody who can get your soldiers ready to fight, but he just wouldn't lead them into battle. He was always scared, it seemed like. I'm not trying to bash the guy, but Lincoln had a lot of people who seemed to be very intimidated with the Southern generals. Grant was not one of them. Sherman was not one of them. George Thomas was not one of them. Oh, I am so sorry. I'm forgetting your name now. Meade. George Meade was not one of them. These were guys, sorry, itching my foot over my sock. These were guys who, these were guys who individually were doing their thing. Under Sherman, he brought all of those people together with the one common goal of ending the war. And these were people that he could trust to lean on. So when Lincoln was telling him, "Hey, look, I don't want to do that," Grant was like, "Look, you want people who are going to fight. So these are people who are going to fight. They're going to get the job done. I trust him. Do you trust me?" Obviously, Lincoln trusted him. So, you know, Lincoln was going to allow him to do what he needed to do. Now, I'm sure Lincoln had a little hook ready, a little cane ready to go. Nope, pull that guy in. Ring that guy in, because I can't have that happening. But he knew that there had to be pain and punishment.
To destroy anything of military value. By November the 11th, Union troops were putting even non-valuable buildings to the torch. Combined with the effects of the shelling and the fires previously started by Hood's men, some 40% of Atlanta would be burned. One Union soldier later recalled, "For miles around the country was as light as day, the flames shooting up for hundreds of feet into the air." But Sherman wasn't fazed. He knew this was just the beginning. On November the 16th, 62,000 Union soldiers at last turned their backs on the charred city. As smoke snaked into the late autumn sky, they pointed in the direction of the Atlantic, some 285 miles east. And so began the March to the Sea. Rather than a single formation, Sherman broke his men into two wings under Oliver O. Howard and Henry W. Slocum, marching 30 miles apart. Providing cover was a small cavalry force, but they were hardly needed. With Hood's army tied up in Tennessee, almost no Confederate forces remained to defend Georgia. In terms of serious fighters, Joseph Wheeler's 3,500 cavalry force was all that was left, enough to harass Sherman's men, but nowhere near enough to stop him or significantly slow them. Beyond that, there were only militias, often formed of teenage boys and old men. When they did attack, it was often like watching the Mighty Ducks take on the Red Army. The Battle of Griswoldville on November the 22nd saw the Georgia militia suffer 10 times the casualties of the Federals. With figures like that, it was clear no one could oppose Sherman, no matter what he did. And with that phrase, we get to the heart of why Sherman's march remains so controversial. For some today, the trail of destruction Sherman cut across Georgia remains an unparalleled act of brutality. Yet if a simple war crime was all it was, there'd be no controversy. Had the Federals slaughtered locals as they moved east, everyone would remember it as an act of villainy. Instead, the shades of grey come from the way that Sherman conducted his campaign. The balancing act he tried to achieve between keeping his forces on a tight leash and doing enough damage to help end the war. You could see this tension in the special field orders that he issued. On the one hand, you have orders that forbade not only the destruction of private property, but the use of abusive language when appropriating supplies. You have two orders forbidding Sherman's men from trespassing or harming locals, and wherever possible, only stealing horses from those rich enough to replace them. On the other hand, though, are the orders placing the ability to destroy mills and houses in the hands of individual commanders, or to unleash, quote, a devastation more or less relentless wherever resistance was encountered. Finally, there's the basic necessity of the army's survival. The moment he struck out from Atlanta, Sherman severed his supply lines. He intended to let his men live off the land, foraging what they needed from the farms. As he put it, where 1 million people live, my army won't starve. The problem is that those 1 million people kind of wanted that food for themselves, the food they'd grown to feed their families, that they needed to survive. But what they wanted no longer mattered. Sherman...
He had to take that food away from the people because he couldn't allow them to possibly be using that food to feed the Confederacy. Is it right? Is it wrong? It's just, it is what it is. And he had to feed his own men. And he cut his supply line on purpose to live off the land.
Was determined to make old and young, rich and poor feel the hard hand of war, to make them really understand the pain of succession. Ultimately, that pain would be so sharp that it'd mark Sherman's reputation for all eternity.
Please forgive me, for I have sinned.
Come on. I will get YouTube Premium. Because now they pay the people I saw.
So we've established the March to the Sea wasn't like some plague of locusts devouring all in its path. But that raises a question. What was it like? If you were a farmer in Sherman's path, what would have been your experience? The first thing to note is that it's unlikely you'd have encountered the main columns. The real issue for Georgia's citizens were the foragers, colloquially known as bummers. A hard nickname for a Brit to say with a straight face, but I did my best. Special Field Order 120 had created designated parties with instructions to forage liberally. As the main column set up camp, these parties would fan out across the countryside, targeting farms. In some cases, targeting meant requisitioning cops, slaughtering animals, even making off with valuables. But it could also mean more. While Sherman may have set limits on his men's behavior, he'd also have given them a lot of wiggle room. And after 3 years of fighting, many Union soldiers used that room to get revenge. Bummers became notorious for ransacking homes, sometimes putting anything they couldn't carry to the torch. Such acts of arson were usually random, but this only added to the fear. Imagine being a subsistence farmer aware the Federals are approaching, aware too that they might destroy your entire livelihood or leave you mostly untouched, and there's nothing you could do to affect that decision. it'd drive you insane. Nor was it only the country dwellers who suffered this anxiety. After a deliberate feint toward the cities of Augusta and Macon, Sherman's 2 columns reached the then capital of Milledgeville around Thanksgiving. There, they attacked buildings and destroyed records before finally entering the state capital and holding a mock vote, rescinding Georgia's ordinance of succession. For residents, the carnival atmosphere was highly unnerving, like watching the Joker play some prank that could turn deadly at any moment. Not that it did. Sherman's men left Milledgeville on November the 24th, leaving a population that was shaken but broadly unharmed. Although there weren't moments of brutality, though. After some Union POWs were found who'd escaped a Confederate camp, some of the foragers were so outraged at their condition that they began revenge attacks on locals. For days, the red glow from barns set alight could be sighted across the countryside. Yet it's worth noting that not all those fires were set by the Yankees. Unable to halt the Union's advance, some of Wheeler's cavalry resorted to scorched earth tactics, starting their own infernos, burning supplies. In the popular imagination, these attacks were often attributed to Sherman, something Uncle Billy did nothing to discourage. A key part of Sherman's strategy was to make the populace mentally suffer, crushed by fear. In this sense, Wheeler's burnings were basically free publicity. In addition to cowing the populace, Sherman was determined to do serious economic damage. Every time his men came across rail tracks, they'd destroy them, heating the metal up with fires and then twisting the rail into unusable shapes, nicknamed Sherman's neckties. Bridges were collapsed, trees felled across roads, telegraph lines torn down. The overall effect was not unlike a Category 5 hurricane sweeping through, the only difference being that this hurricane actively enjoyed messing up the economy. In the context of the Deep South at the time, this also meant freeing slaves. Today, the treatment of formerly enslaved people on the march is controversial, because while Sherman's men did free them, they were frequently racist themselves, treating the freed people with disrespect and even threats of violence. But even the most disrespectful common soldier had nothing on Jefferson C. Davis. A Union general, unlike his near-identically named Southern counterpart, Davis was in charge of getting the Army's rearguard over a pontoon bridge across Ebenezer Creek on December the 9th. There had been heavy rains and the river was swollen. When 650 fugitive slaves following the march tried to cross, Davis ordered them to wait until his men were over. When the last Union soldier was across, Davis had the pontoon bridge unlashed, trapping the freed slaves on the other side. Desperate not to be recaptured, knowing Wheeler's men were near, many tried to swim for safety. While some made it, hundreds are thought to have drowned. It was the greatest single loss of life on the entire march, and also the most shameful, especially when Sherman later defended Davis's actions. But by now, the march was almost over. On December the...
I've heard about the reason why he defended it, and that there were too many people. They had too many mouths to feed. I understand that. But you got to tell them, listen, we're going to cross and we're going that way. You can cross, but you can't follow us. You got to go that way. You keep going north, but you can't keep following us because it's putting our military in jeopardy. But what was done, yeah, you just, that's...
12th, Union forces sighted Savannah, the city they'd spent the best part of a month reaching. Now all they had to do was take it. Ultimately, Savannah's fate was decided in just 15 minutes. Determined to avoid a siege, Sherman instead threw his men at Fort McAllister on December the 13th, the key link in the city's southern defenses. It was a suicidal charge, one that saw the Union's casualty rate triple that of the fort's defenders. But Sherman had the numbers on his side. In just a quarter of an hour, Fort McAllister had fallen, and just like that, defending Savannah became impossible. The Confederate garrison inside put up a good show, refusing to surrender when Sherman demanded it. But they knew as well as anyone that the game was up. On the night of December the 20th, they quietly evacuated the city, fleeing across the river into South Carolina. The next day, the city surrendered. On December the 22nd, Sherman telegrams Lincoln, presenting him Savannah as a Christmas gift. With that action, the March to the Sea came to a victorious end. Over the last 37 days, Sherman's men had covered 285 miles. In that time, they'd destroyed 300 miles of railroad, confiscated 5,000 horses, 400 mules, and 13,000 cattle, and requisitioned 10 million pounds of corn. Nearly every cotton gin and mill they encountered, the backbone of the economy, had been smashed. Homes had been damaged, barns set alight, entire farms laid to waste. From being the South's breadbasket, Georgia became a place that could barely feed itself.
They also demanded the cotton, available free cotton. Well, not free, but they demanded all the cotton to be put like in the center of town. And they gave you a heads up. We'll be there tomorrow. Cotton. And we won't decimate the place. But if you don't give the cotton, we will destroy everything. A couple cities were like, calling your bluff. City was destroyed. Cotton was eventually taken. If it wasn't set on fire, it was put on ships and sent north, and it was sold. One town did actually provide the cotton. And it was the town that a young Woodrow Wilson, he was born in Virginia, but his dad was a preacher, and he moved to Georgia. And he lived in this town. And it was the only town on this path that didn't get destroyed. And they think the reason why it didn't get destroyed, not because they put the cotton up, was because a woman that William Tecumseh Sherman had fallen in love with when he was teaching in the South. The woman just, I guess, refused to marry him or whatever. But her family lived in this town, so he saved that town. Side note.
By his own estimate, Sherman placed the cost of all this destruction at $100 million. That's not in today's dollars. That's $100 million in old-timey money. Today it'd be more like $1.7 billion. Sherman had wanted to make the state howl. Well, this was that cry made flesh. Yet while the economic costs were high, the human cost was relatively small. During the whole 6 weeks of the March to the Sea, under 3,000 casualties were reported, few of whom were civilians. Compared to other infamous actions in the Civil War, Sherman's March to the Sea was a mere drop in an ocean of blood. Then there was the fact of all the newly freed slaves. Despite the shameful episode at Ebenezer Creek, Sherman's men had freed a staggering number of slaves en route to Savannah, anywhere between 17 and 25,000. Famously, this led, on January 16, 1865, to Special Field Orders 15, which confiscated 400,000 acres of land and divided it into 40-acre plots, with each plot going to one black family. Although President Andrew Johnson would quickly rescind this order, it remains a landmark moment in US history. So, at the end of it all then, how are we to judge Sherman's infamous expedition? Well, on its own terms, there's no doubt it succeeded. Sherman wanted to bring total war to the South, to demoralize its citizens, cripple its economy, and end its ability to make war. At all three of those goals, he succeeded. To this day, the humiliation of the March to the Sea remains a potent Southern memory. Meanwhile, there are economists who have documented lasting negative effects on Georgian agriculture as late as 1920. The war, too, ended soon after, following a far more brutal march Sherman took through the Carolinas, potentially something we'll cover in a future episode. But while the March to the Sea was certainly...
Carolina was the first state to secede, and so he went through Georgia, then he looked north to South Carolina, and he said they were the first ones to secede, so they started all of this. So what he did to Georgia was nothing compared to what he wanted to do to South Carolina.
A success. Was it justifiable? Was it, in short, a military necessity? Or was it a crime? All we can say is that this is a question people have been wrestling with for nearly 160 years, and it's unlikely to go away anytime soon. To Sherman's defenders, the narrative that this campaign was an exercise in brutality will always be overblown. To his attackers, it will forever remain a stark example of how civilians were forced to needlessly suffer at a celebrated general's hands. One thing, however, is certain. Whether you think this was a tale of villainy or strategy, it's clear that Sherman's March to the Sea continues to resonate across American history in all sorts of profound ways. Whichever side of the debate we fall on, we should all at least agree that its lessons should never be forgotten. So I really hope you found this video interesting.
Okay. So the reason why I did that video, there's a couple shorts. I visited Sherman's grave in St. Louis, Missouri. And so he was born in Ohio. He was a teacher in Louisiana. I want to say New Orleans, the city, but don't quote me. He joined the Union, and after the war, people in St. Louis dedicated a home to him. And so he took it and he went there and moved, and he lived out the last of his years in St. Louis. And it was a common thing in that time because Galena, Illinois, Grant had lived there just before the war started. He lived there working as a tanner in his dad's tannery, which he hated it. But during the war, when he kind of developed a name, a bunch of these citizens, the richer citizens, came together, had a house built, and gave it to him. Kind of spoils of war. Had the Confederacy won, I'm sure the same thing would have happened for them. So, but that's the reason why I did these videos, Cahokia Mounds, Daniel Boone, and this is just because I went there and I want people to understand a little bit more about them, because those two are vital in American history. And then Cahokia Mounds is just a very cool thing in the history of the continent of America and just the early people who are here. Just my throwing respect at those people. So I won't get into the regular spiel, but there's a thanks button. You can donate to the channel. You don't have to. Subscribe, that helps. Give a thumbs up. And until next time, have a good day, have a good night. Thanks for watching.